So we have our player status script attached to our first person controller. And folks, this doesn't work if you don't follow this procedure. This first person controller has to have the player status script attached to it. And to confirm that we have the player status script attached to it, we can select the first person controller. Once we have the first person controller selected, we can look through its components. And these components happen in chronological order. It's, whatever the last script is that you attach, that's the one at the bottom. So if I look right down at the bottom, I see that there's a player script attached. It just so happens, we may or may not have looked at this before, but it just so happens that our first person controller, had a couple of scripts that were already attached to it. And these came, Unity provided these for us. So we had this thing called a mouse look script, which is the thing that allows us to look around with our mouse when we're walking in our first person controller. We had the character motor, which governed the way that we move through our environment. And so if we look at this, there are some public variables. We have things like maximum speed, sideways speed. We have this slope speed multiplier, all sorts of things, how gravity is affecting us, how high we jump, if we can in fact jump, and so on. So there are all these variables, and I would encourage you to resist the urge to play with any of those just yet. Or if you do, just make sure that you jot down their original values and convert them back, or trash the first person controller and reintroduce it, because it's pretty easy to knock things out of whack. But there were scripts that existed on this, and we just added a player status script. Now, once the player status script is attached to the player object, the next thing that we can do is we can start to look at this cube object that we introduced as an experimental object that we can interact with. In order to be able to interact with this object, I've created a pickup script here, and if I just double click on the pickup script, that'll open in MonoDevelop. And we can look at this script. Basically what it's doing is it's not doing anything during the update cycle. So it's doing one thing one time, and what it's doing is it's checking to see if the player status, an object with the player status on it, collided with the object. So there's only one object that has the player status script attached to it, and that's our player. And if it does, it's going to add points, and it's also going to add this to this object collect. We'll take a closer look at those a little bit later. And then finally, it's going to destroy the game object. Okay, so basically it adds whatever the point value is of the object to the player, and it destroys the game object. Now, I'll just jump back into Unity. I'll take this pickup script and I'll click and drag and drop it onto my cube. There we go. I could have selected the cube and dragged it into the components here, but I look at the pickup script and I see that it's attached. I also notice that there's a point value which I can assign, but I'll do that later. Right now I'll just leave it set to 0. Now if I hit the play button and I run over here, where's my cube? There it is. And I run over and I run into the cube, nothing's happening. It's working just as it did before. And the reason for that is that this script is specifically calling for this cube to have a trigger. So I'm looking with the cube selected. I'm looking in this box collider component. I want to make sure isTrigger is turned on. Okay, so if I go look at the pickup script, the function is looking to see if the trigger's been entered. And until we check it, it's not a trigger. Okay, so until we tell that object to listen to see if it's been triggered, it's not going to execute any of this stuff. Okay, so we've just told it to be a trigger, and so now when I hit play, I find the object and I go run into it. One, I can pass right through it, but then when I look back around for it, it's gone. Okay, and that's because of this little line of code that's right here at the end that says destroy game object. And what that's saying is whatever object this is attached to, destroy it. Okay, and you'll notice that when we run our Unity game or Unity simulation at this point, you'll notice that we have this cube object and that the script is attached to, and once we run into it, this disappears from the hierarchy. So let me hit play and keep your eye on this cube value here. When I run into that cube, the cube disappears. It's been destroyed from the hierarchy. So that object is no longer there. So it did a couple of things. That script destroys the game object, okay, but it also passes this points value to the player status script, which is the thing that we attach to the first person controller, and it executes this function called add points. So, if I was really curious about what's going on here, I could go into the player status and say, there was something about add points. And there's a function called add points. I can see it right there. Okay, so there's a function add points. So it's looking for this script called player status, okay, which it found over here attached to this game object. And it's going to execute a function called add points, and it's going to take whatever the point value is, send it over to this script, and whatever the points are, it's going to add that to the total points. And the total points are being tracked by this script. Okay, so we have this value of total points, and if we go back to our Unity game, I'll just select my cube. Right now, this cube is worth 0 points. Well, let me bump that up to 10. So now, when I hit the play button, I run into my cube, I destroy it, I've earned 10 points. I have no idea where those points are, what even the significance of earning 10 points are. But I know that I've earned 10 points, and it must be good for something. But we'll start to track that down and start to track the variables that we've earned. We'll do that in the next presentation. So for now, get a handle on incorporating objects into Unity. In this case, we want to have some kind of a game object, whether we create it from Cinema 4D or introduce it directly from Unity. We're going to introduce a game object, make sure that it has a collider on it. Once it has a collider on it, make sure that that collider is a trigger. I'll just move this down and over a little bit. So we have cube number 2 here. It's called cube just the same. Make sure that the pickup script is attached to the game object. Again, make sure that the box collider is on and that it's set to a trigger. And then as long as you have this player status script attached to the first person controller, you can interact with that object. So I now have 2 cubes. I can pick up the first cube and I earn 10 points. I pick up this cube and I don't earn anything because that second cube, if I look at that second cube I introduced, its point value is still set to 0. So if I wanted to learn less points or earn 5 points for picking up this cube, I could just set that point value here on this game object inside that component. In the next presentation, we'll start to talk about a heads-up display that reveals our points and keeps track of the number of objects that we've collected. And we'll do that in the next presentation.